Thank you for inviting me to this very, very important conference here today. One important reason why there is no peace in the Middle East can be summarized tragically in two letters, UN. That building, dedicated in theory to peace, has facilitated terrorism, stood idly by genocide, given a platform to Holocaust deniers, and disincentivized the Palestinians from negotiating a reasonable two-state solution. Just think back, to summarize what others before me have said, think back to one dramatic year, 1975, when between 2 and 3 million Cambodians were being murdered by Pol Pot. The United Nations devoted all of its time to debating whether Zionism was racism and did not spend one single session in trying to stop the bloodshed in Cambodia. Just think about that. Think about what happened several decades later when genocides were taking place in Rwanda and Darfur, and the United Nations was debating the building of houses on the West Bank. Just think of how often the rights of women, the rights of gays, the rights of minorities have been ignored because the United Nations has been able to say, we have no time for these minor rights. We have to focus on the major oppressor of the world, namely Israel. The United Nations has encouraged anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry by giving its imprimatur to that disgraceful word called Durban, which will go down in history next to another city called Nuremberg. And the idea that two such beautiful cities, Durban and Nuremberg, have been so profaned by actions and words that have been taken and spoken in their name is a simple disgrace. I want to focus on the fact that the United Nations has for 40 years rewarded Palestinian terrorism by enhancing the status of Palestine while Arafat and Hamas were openly advocating and implementing the murder of Jewish civilians as a matter of governmental policy. This was not an accident. This was the policy of the Palestine Liberation Organization, of Fatah, of Hamas. And yet, while they were murdering and killing and violating the Charter of the UN, we saw gradual, incremental, but very important steps to the point where the Palestinians virtually own the United Nations. You know, you can't even get into the United Nations if you are a representative of some oppressed group, whether it be in Tibet or in other parts of the world. They won't even let them into the front door because the building is essentially occupied by interests of the Palestinians in statehood. The United Nations has become the main advocacy arm for one group of people, the Palestinians, and thereby neglecting the rights of so many other people, whether they be the Kurds or the Armenians or the Tatars or the Chechens or so many others who have been brutally repressed. And now there will be a vote at the United Nations. We don't know its exact terms. We don't know exactly where. We don't know exactly when. But that vote will take place, and dozens of countries that do not recognize Israel's right to exist. I'm not talking about as the nation state of the Jewish people, which the Palestinians don't recognize. I'm talking about not recognizing Israel's right to exist. These nations will cast a vote, and the vote will be described as implementing the two-state solution. How can you implement a two-state solution if so many of the people voting don't recognize the existence of the other state? These countries which do not recognize Israel are not voting for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They are voting for a final solution to the Jewish state problem. And that is the truth. I submit here today that no state that refuses to recognize Israel should have its vote counted at the United Nations in recognizing Palestine, because the vote purports to be part of a vote in favor of a two-state solution. So how can Saudi Arabia cast a vote? How can so many other countries cast a vote in favor of a two-state solution if they are unwilling even to vote for one state that is supposed to be part of that two-state solution? What incredible hypocrisy. The United Nations, while demanding far too much of Israel, never, ever makes any demands on the Palestinian people or on the PLO or on Hamas or on any aspect of the Palestinian cause. I challenge you to find any document at the United Nations which demands of Palestine that it do A, B, C, or D. They simply don't exist. Why should the Palestinians compromise to get recognition when they are handed it by the United Nations without the need to compromise? It would be absurd for the Palestinians who have a self-interest to compromise if the UN says we'll give you everything you want without compromising. Why should the Palestinians change their proposed undemocratic constitution? How many in the UN know that the Palestinian constitution calls for one official established religion, Islam, and says that the primary source of legislation in Palestine will be Sharia law? Imagine what that will do to the right of gays. Imagine that what it will do to the right of Christians. Unfortunately or fortunately, the issue of what it will do to the rights of Jews in Palestine is moot, because the delegate of Palestine to the United Nations has recently affirmed that Palestine will be the first officially Judenrein state since the end of Nazi Germany. Now he's had to clarify and spin, and he said we only don't want Jews who are part of the occupation, or Jews who are here illegally, or Jews who are here or there or the other thing. But believe me, Jews will not be welcomed into the new Palestine as equal citizens the way that Arabs and Muslims are welcomed to Israel as equal citizens under the law. That will never happen because the United Nations does not demand it. Why should the Palestinians have to clarify their statement from their ambassador if nobody is even asking them to admit Jews? Nobody is even asking them to present a democratic front to the world. Oh, they talk about secular democracy. They talk to the West about secular democracy. That's not what they say to their own people. What they say to their own people is it will be a state governed by Sharia law, a state in which Jews will be excluded, a state, interestingly enough, which has a law of return, and it's written by the very people who condemn Israel as racist for having a law of return. The incredible hypocrisy and double standard that one hears every day emanating from that building. Why should the Palestinians negotiate the kind of land swap repeatedly offered by Israel, today most recently described in an op-ed by former Prime Minister Olmert, if they can get the pre-1967 borders as a starting point and perhaps an ending point? Let me clarify what that means. Everybody says pre-1967 borders with agreed-upon swaps. Well, let me tell you, I had a conversation with Prime Minister Fayyad about those agreed-upon swaps. And what he said was very interesting. He said, sure, we'll swap, but what is real estate? There's only one criteria for the value of real estate: location, location, location. He knows his American rules. And he said, what's the most valuable piece of real estate on the face of the earth? The center of Jerusalem, where the Western Wall exists. You want the Western Wall back? Fine. You're going to have to give us 10,000 dunim to get several dunim of holy land. You want the access route to Hebrew University, which under the pre-67 borders would belong to Palestine? Fine, we'll give you that back. You have to give us back thousands and thousands of acres. You want the Jewish quarter? You're not entitled to the Jewish quarter, they say. That's part of pre-67 Jordan. Therefore, we get the Jewish quarter. We get, the Palestinians are saying, we get the access road to Jerusalem. We get the Western Wall, and we'll maybe negotiate with you. We'll hold these three most sacred aspects of Jewish life hostage to a negotiation. Who would ever imagine starting a negotiation from that point? Starting a negotiation with Israel not even having access to its most holy places and have to bargain for that. I helped draft, right in these buildings, Resolution 242 of the UN. I was working at the time for Arthur Goldberg as an informal assistant when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. And there is no doubt that 242 contemplated territorial adjustments and changes. There was a big debate about that. The Russians and the French wanted to use the word the territories. The British and the United States said no, territories, territories. And Lyndon Johnson and the ambassador from Great Britain and Arthur Goldberg, all on the floor of the United Nations and in other venues, said Israel must make territorial adjustments to prevent a recurrence of 1967. And yet the idea of starting at the 67 borders with possible mutually agreed upon swaps. What do mutually agreed upon mean? One side doesn't agree, they're not swaps. So it ends where it begins. Why should the Palestinians give that up if they're going to get that kind of recognition? So why should the Palestinians accept a demilitarized state? Today in the op-ed by former Prime Minister Al-Merritt, he mentioned that in his offer, the state had to be demilitarized. The Palestinians are now backing away from any acceptance of that. Why? The UN hasn't insisted that it be a demilitarized state. As far as the UN's concerned, it can be a fully militarized state, with treaties with Iran, with treaties with other countries sworn to the destruction of Israel. Why should the Palestinians not insist on the absurd and immoral right to return to Israel rather than to a Palestinian state when the United Nations supports this peace-ending condition? There can be no peace if there is a full right of return, because a right of return is a way of turning Israel into yet another Islamic fundamentalist Palestinian state. President Obama got it right in his address to the United Nations yesterday. There can be no peace without mutual compromise, and the UN declarations are the enemy of compromise. This is what he said. Peace will not come through statements and resolutions at the United Nations. He might have added, because the United Nations has no moral authority when it comes to Israel or to the Jewish people or to the Jewish nation. It simply does not. How dare states such as Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran, Bahrain, Syria, Belarus, and other tyrannies too numerous to mention, but if you want to see the list, just go over to the next building. Read the list of nation states, and you'll see more than half of them fit this definition of undemocratic tyrannies. How dare those tyrannies lecture Israel about human rights? How dare states such as Turkey, that have attacked their own Kurdish minorities and Armenian minorities, and Russia, which has attacked its own Chechnyan minority. Does no one recognize the need for a single neutral standard of human rights? Have human rights now become the permanent weapon of choice for those who practice human wrongs? For shame! For shame! Tiny Israel has contributed more to the progress of the world, more to the welfare of the world, more to the hope for peace than almost all of the nations combined that sit in that building. Think of how many lives Israel has saved through its medical technology, how many Arab and Muslim lives have been saved through Israel's medical technology, how much benefit has been achieved by Israel's environmental breakthroughs, how much Israel has done to feed the hungry with its agricultural development, which it exports to the world, how much Israel has done to help those afflicted by natural disasters when Israel is always the first to be there, and the member states across the street condemn it for sending people to Haiti to do organ harvesting. And you hear that stated with seriousness by some people across the room. And yes, Israel has done more, contributed more to the world in teaching them how to fight terrorism within the rule of law. The United States is now following the Israeli model, using drones and targeted killings approved by the Israeli Supreme Court in very carefully thought through opinions. Israel has become the model of Western democracy in fighting asymmetrical warfare. All Israel wants now is to be able to beat its swords into plowshares, to turn its nuclear weapons into nuclear medicine. If that's what the Palestinians also want, let them come to the negotiating table rather than seeking a hollow victory from that body. Thank you.